This is WiseBox Podcast.
Welcome to the WiseBox Education Podcast. I'm Alex Noche. I'm a linguist, and I'm the founder of WiseBox Education. I'm joined today by Martín Ochoa. He's an English teacher in a language institute here in Colombia. Hi, Martín. Nice to meet you.
How are you, Alex?
Thanks for joining us today on a first podcast. So this will be the first in a series of podcasts that deal with best practices in the language teaching classroom. Martín and I are going to talk about those mistakes. And so let's get started.
Ready? Let's get started.
All right. Mistake number one, starting a lesson with grammar. Have you ever started a lesson talking about grammar? Is that something you normally do, Martín?
Usually I start my lessons with a small talk, just some conversation for about 5-10 minutes.
That's great.
Yeah.
I try to keep small talk to a minimum, and you want to try to connect small talk to the lesson objective if possible. A common mistake that teachers make when they engage in small talk with students is that they give them level inappropriate prompts. They ask them questions and they're not prepared to respond to those questions. That's a problem. So starting with small talk is great, but starting with grammar, that's a problem. Students don't come to class to study grammar. They, especially beginner students and intermediate students, they come to learn and to acquire the language and to make meaning out of everything around them, all the input around them, the listening input and the reading input. So main reason is you don't want to distract students from their focus on meaning, because that's what they focus on. So when we have them focus on form, which is grammar and syntax, what you're doing is you're confusing them, and they're becoming cognitively overloaded.
So what would you say is like a good way to start a lesson? First,
So a little bit of small talk is great, like you do.
small talk.
That's perfect. Keep it to minimum, 3 minutes. Get right into an activation activity, some kind of warm up or review activity,
Okay.
and then show some pictures, maybe, of the lesson objective that's related to the lesson objective. Have them use their schema, their prior knowledge. That's a good way to start. And
Maybe a recap.
do a recap of the last lesson. What you don't want them doing is talking about something that they're not prepared to talk about.
Okay.
That's what you want to avoid. And we definitely don't want to start a lesson talking about grammar.
So you're telling me I shouldn't teach grammar?
No, Martín, I'm not saying that at all. We should definitely teach grammar, but remember, in the early stages of language acquisition, teachers and learners should be focusing on fluency over grammatical competence.
Okay.
So we'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later.
Okay.
Okay, Martín, let's move on to mistake number 2.
All right.
Interrupting students to give explicit corrective feedback.
It's a big one.
How do you give feedback to students when they make errors?
So in my experience, usually when a student is speaking, I correct them immediately. If they mispronounce the word, I correct them immediately. I stop them, say correct.
Stop them mid-sentence.
Mid-sentence. That's usually the way I do things. I want them.
You got a big smile on your face.
Yeah.
Right? You're happy doing that.
Yeah. I enjoy correcting them. I usually don't wait for them to finish and then correct at the end. I like to interject.
You have to take it. And generally, explicit corrective feedback is generally very effective. However, it does often have a cost. It has an emotional cost. So I've observed hundreds of teachers of about 20 different languages.
Right.
And what I notice when they give corrective feedback is that they're kind of like a tiger. They pounce.
Yep.
They pounce on the student.
Exactly.
And even though the student doesn't react in a negative way, they can have negative feelings towards the instructor. They might feel targeted, and they might shut down. They might be inhibited to produce in the target language. And one important thing is you need to explain how you give feedback at the beginning of a class.
Okay.
So when you meet your students and you talk about expectations in the class, you need to give expectations for corrective feedback. Now, if you tell your students, I'm going to correct you and I'm going to interrupt you, they're probably not going to feel great about that, but at least they know what's coming.
They know, yeah.
Exactly. So it's really important to explain the different kinds of feedback that you're going to give them. So you got to complement the pouncing technique. Pouncing once in a while is okay, like a tiger, you know. However, you need to include other different types of feedback. Corrective feedback that's more communicative.
So, Alex, what would be an example of another way of using corrective feedback that's not the pouncing?
The pouncing technique. Okay.
Yeah, the pouncing.
So one other is not for beginner learners, but more for upper novice and maybe intermediate learners, is using a recast.
A recast.
So a student makes a mistake, you model the correct form, or the correct pronunciation in this case, and you keep the conversation going, so it's not intrusive. So you're not stopping the flow of the conversation or the discourse or the utterances. That's really important. So what you're doing when you pounce on a student, when you interrupt a student, what you're doing is you're stopping the flow of the conversation.
Right.
In order to give, and you're focusing your attention on the student's mistake.
And that stops their flow.
And that stops their flow. And that can cause problems for future oral production.
Okay.
So when you do something like a recast, now a recast is not as effective as explicit, direct, corrective feedback. However, it's more communicative. And when it's more communicative, it allows for students to feel much more relaxed. So when you're constantly giving explicit feedback, you might be contributing to a high rate, tense, and anxious learning environment.
Yeah, I've seen that happen in the classroom various times.
Exactly. So you got to remember, you have to have a balance of communicative and non-communicative techniques.
Right.
So the explicit feedback is negative feedback. The recast neutralizes that negative feedback and turns it into kind of a positive corrective feedback.
Okay. And an example of recast would be, let's say I'm the student and I say, I go to church this weekend.
Okay. Oh, I went to church as well. What church do you attend?
Right. So what you did there is, you replied correctly using the correct form. And that way the student realizes, oh, so this is how I should say it, instead of correcting my mistake.
Exactly.
Immediately.
And I emphasize the word went, which is the form.
Exactly.
So I focused on the form, the correct form. I modeled it, but I didn't stop the conversation. Kept this conversation flowing, and that's neutralizing negative feedback.
Yeah, I like that. I think I'm going to start trying that out.
The important thing is that you need to have a toolbox of corrective feedback strategies. And you need to explain those strategies that you're going to use with them to the class so they know what to expect.
Letting the students know beforehand, for sure. Of course.
So mistake number 3, students aren't interacting enough with each other. How do you feel about that?
So personally, in my experience, I struggle with this as a teacher. My students usually interact with each other when I prompt them to. So there's not much interaction going on apart from the activities that I suggest.
Okay. So just as we did with corrective feedback, you need to establish expectations about feedback. You need to establish expectations for interacting with each other. So generally, a teacher interacts with students and students interact with a teacher.
Correct.
But to get students to interact with each other is a big challenge for language educators. Probably one of the biggest challenges in the language teaching classroom is getting students to collaborate, interact with each other. In order to create a learner-centered learning environment, classroom, you need to get students to do this.
And what would be a good way to get them to interact without me having to prompt them?
So we need to model interactive behavior. It needs to become part of their behavior when they're in the classroom. So naturally, students interact with each other in their native language.
In their native language. That is the issue. They usually communicate with each other in their native language and not.
But when they're in a classroom, they freeze up.
Exactly.
It's a very prescriptive environment in which they feel that they can only speak when spoken to, generally by the instructor.
Right.
So you need to establish those guidelines. You need to get students to ask questions, so you need to prompt them to ask questions. John, can you ask Matthew 2 questions about his hobbies? That's peer questioning.
Okay.
Get them to do it. So you need to prompt them to do it. Then after a while, they do it on their own.
Right.
Get them to interject in the conversation. So we're having a conversation, and there are other students, and they're just watching. And maybe they're distracted, or maybe they get bored. They should interject at appropriate times.
Of course.
So interjection is not interruption. When students interject, what are they doing? They're making a comment about what we're talking about.
It's good to have an opinion, of course.
They're asking a follow-up question. They're reacting to the conversation. Wow. Right? So they become part of the conversation. That's another way to get students to interact with each other.
Of course. Great.
Teaching mistake number 4. Teacher is confusing the students.
Oh, yeah. I deal with that a lot.
Yeah? Give me an example.
So I have students who tell me, oh, teacher, I'm not understanding, maybe you speak a little too fast, or
You translate a lot for your students into Spanish?
I do translate.
Most of your students are Spanish speakers,
Most of my
learning English?
Spanish speakers learning English, yep.
And so you're doing a lot of phrase level translation for them?
Yes. So they ask me in Spanish, for example, can you explain this? I'm not understanding. And then I feel compelled to answer them in Spanish.
Yeah.
And then it becomes, 2 minutes of speaking in Spanish. And
Exactly.
We're deviating from the path.
Remember, students come to class to learn the target language.
Of course.
They don't come to talk in the native language, but they feel confused often. There are a couple reasons for that. That could be the way you're speaking. You might be speaking too quickly without any pauses. So you need to employ a technique called speech modification. So you need to modify, adjust your speech. That doesn't mean you speak slow like this, right? When you're speaking like a robot, it means that you chunk your speech into units. So for example, an example of chunking could be, the other day, I went to the supermarket with my mother.
Just pausing in between.
Yeah. So you take an utterance or phrase or a long sentence, and you break it up into units. Usually about 3 units is fine. That'll help your students process the input a little bit better.
Of course.
The listening input.
I also tend to use my hands a lot
That's great.
to explain situations.
Total physical response, what we call TPR.
Exactly.
That's another great scaffolding technique. That's providing support to the student.
Of course. Of course.
And another thing to remember is the input that you're giving your students might be far above their level.
Yeah.
That's going to get them into the challenge, frustration level. You want to keep it in that I+1 level, interlanguage +1, meaning slightly above their functional level. That's fine. You want students to be a little confused. That's okay.
A little challenged.
And, but not challenged so much that they're frustrated. You want to give them input where they're getting the gist. So if they're understanding everything that they read or they listen to, that's a problem because they get comfortable.
Right.
You don't want students to be comfortable. You want them to be on the edge of their seat a little bit. Because that's going to get them to pay attention. Maybe they'll take better notes. They'll use different learning strategies like cognates or context clues or things like that. Those are different types of ways to keep students focused.
Right.
That students need, when students are too comfortable and they understand everything, then you need to provide input that's a little bit more challenging.
So I've also heard about the modeling technique, like model input. Could you explain?
Yeah. So in order to have students develop fluency, improve their pronunciation, you need to model.
Okay.
So you need to model written input. You need to model listening input by using speech modification. So you need to be the model native speaker for your students.
Right.
And so when you model new input, you also need to ask them comprehension questions, basic comprehension questions, verify comprehension.
Comprehension checks, yeah.
Yeah. So you need to do that as well as the modeling.
Okay.
Teaching mistake number 5. Now this is a teaching mistake that we all commit. Saying, do you understand?
Guilty.
Guilty.
Guilty. Yeah.
How often do you do it doing an hour?
I'd say probably twice. Twice. And usually to the student who's struggling the most. He's kind of falling behind. I say, hey,
How does a student react when you say, do you understand?
just looks at me with a blank face.
Okay.
Doesn't understand.
And then you move on.
And then I try my best to explain, but if he's not catching on, I tend to move on, yeah.
So we need to eliminate that phrase from your teaching repertoire. Yeah, I don't think you should ever ask any student, do they understand?
What would be a good alternative?
A good alternative is just to do consistent comprehension checks.
Okay.
Verifying comprehension. Okay. So with your struggling students, you can do very simple comprehension checks. So the value of comprehension checks is that you're going to be able to evaluate formatively evaluate their progress.
Right.
That's important. Students are going to be more engaged, and you're going to be able to progress through different phases of the lesson, knowing that your students are ready to go to the next lesson phase. So I would start off for beginner, maybe lower intermediate learners, binary options such as true or false, yes or no, A or B,
Or B.
right? Like, what color is Mary's shirt? Is it red or is it blue, right? Or Mary's shirt is red, true or false, yes or no? Something like that. Keep it very simple. And the value of doing the comprehension checks is that you're recycling the vocabulary, the targeted vocabulary from the lesson. So that's another positive about doing consistent comprehension checks.
Asking, do you understand to a student doesn't get you.
No. So you want to conduct consistent comprehension checks throughout a lesson, especially at the beginning of a lesson.
Okay.
When you're exposing them. So what you want to achieve during the first part of the lesson when you're presenting new input, new information, is multiple exposures to the vocabulary. And you can achieve that by doing comprehension checks.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thanks, Martin, for being part of the first WiseBox podcast. I'd love to have you on again soon.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
All right.
WiseBox offers a number of different courses related to language teaching for beginner teachers, for professional teachers, and for mentors. For more information, click on the link below.
This is WiseBox Podcast.